So this is the rough cut review of the recent remake of Total Recall, which is, I'm sure you all know, is a remake of the classic 1990s Arnie movie, which, funnily enough, was criticised at the time for being out of step with the thinking of the time, but we all think back on it now as very good fun. The new version, it stars Colin Farrell, and thanks to In Bruges and a couple of other roles, I can't write him off completely as a terrible actor. It's also got Kate Beckinsale as Doug Quaid's wife. So, for the good stuff. So, in terms of visual style, it's fairly ambitious. It doesn't always work, and quite often the visual effects look slightly duff. But there are two very fine actors here in the leader of the good guys, Bill Nighy, and as the antagonist, it's Bryan Cranston. I have to say, I think both of which are underused. I'd love to have seen a Bryan Cranston chewing the scenery. I think it would have been brilliant fun, but we don't get to see as much of that as I'd have liked. Also important to note, this film doesn't feature Mars at all. It's mentioned at one point as sort of a nod to the original, but it's set between Britain, which is a nice place but they're bad, and the colony, which is Australia, the oppressed masses. Now the relationship between the two seems to vary throughout the film, but I'll go into that in a little while. Firstly, the visual style. So it's very clear that the director loves his sci-fi. So in terms of influences, it's so obvious that he's been inspired by Metropolis and Blade Runner, which is just so obvious. Now, this is one of the fundamentals of the film that really bothers me. So we've got Britain and Australia, which is the colony. Firstly, we don't believe that Britain would survive a global chemical war, fine, but that's by the by. I was sort of getting over the disappointment of knowing that Mars wasn't in the film, and then actually I was thinking, well, actually they could do something fairly interesting with a sort of neo-colonial relationship between Britain and Australia. I think there's something interesting there, but they don't go into this at all. I mean, you sort of get to Australia and it's all pretty grim, but it could be anywhere. I mean, all it is the city from Blade Runner. That's all it is. There's a lot of the people are Chinese. There's lots of Chinese imagery. There's Polish writing all over the place, and you don't get a sense. It's not Britain and Australia. It's just two places that the director seems to have picked out, or the producers picked out of a hat. I mean, it could be Cambodia and Sri Lanka. I mean, for all the difference it would make. The antagonist seems to be American. People seem to be from all over the world living in the two areas. So there is nothing to be said about the Britain and Australia. There just isn't anything to be said. So the plot makes next to no sense. And the bad guy's plan, when we find out what it is it makes about the same amount of sense. It's just an excuse to set up a load of set pieces. So it's muddled and ripped off and just confused and largely pointless. And very forgettable, actually. It's one of those films that's extremely loud, but you just don't care. You're not engaged. So as I've said, I mean, if they'd have taken Philip K. Dick's source material and made it more surreal and, confused you a little bit more. I mean, bear in mind, Inception came out a few years ago now. I'm sure that there can be an intelligent blockbuster because there's already been one, but we don't get any of that stuff. There is stuff in there that what makes a man, what makes a person. Is it your memories? Is it your actions? But it seems that the film very skillfully swerves around anything that might be potentially interesting. And you never get the idea that perhaps Farrell's character isn't the super agent. I mean, it's played so straight that clearly there's not going to be a twist. Is Colin Farrell a leading man? On this performance, again, it's a no from me. I didn't care about his character at all. I didn't believe or buy into any of the characters, in fact. And worst of all for me was the incredibly consistently bad Kate Beckinsale. She just looks very odd now. I mean, in a certain light, she looks incredibly attractive. But then, in this film, it's so obvious she's had all kinds of physical work done on her, cosmetic surgery or whatever it is. And, she just keeps turning up again and, increasingly silly situations and trying to chase down Colin Farrell. And, all right, it's not Michael Ironside, but Michael Ironside was great, So, it's not interesting. It's loud and boring. And actually, I was watching this with a good friend of mine, and we were sitting right in the front row, right in the middle. And during the, another excruciatingly dull thumping action sequence, my friend was asleep. So that's exactly. It's just loud and boring, and it's why does this film exist? I mean, other than to make money, there's no. They're not adding anything to the canon. They're not doing anything interesting. They've not taken this in another direction. All they're doing is cashing in. So I don't really want to go into too much detail on Kate Beckinsale's performance, but it really did bother me. She really is reining it in again. And I mean, the film, to give you a point of reference, it reminds me of Luc Besson's recent films, most noticeably Lockout. Because that had really terrible CGI. I mean, the CGI is better in this, but not by enough. It doesn't look good, and that doesn't have Guy Pearce in it. And Guy Pearce, for me, and that was really enjoyable. So, all in all, I'm trying not to get too upset about this because I hate it. I mean, it's last year's remake of The Thing was a real low point for me, and this is not far off. But it's boring. It's loud. It's boring. It'll probably make its money back. But let's just move on.